You think we're playing games, kid? This is for real.
So's this.
Because nothing is ever as it seems.
Welcome to Hamburgers and Horror, the home of meat, monsters, and men who are tall. I'm Noah Hook, and today we're looking at Phantasm 3, Lord of the Dead. This 1994 sci-fi horror sequel takes place 2 years after the previous film as Mike awakens from a coma. A new tall man emerges and captures him, and Reggie hits the road hoping to track them down. Along the way, he befriends a murderous little boy and a badass woman with the shared goal of killing the tall man for good. Phantasm 3 was of course written and directed by Don Coscarelli, who helmed the two previous films. It also stars Angus Scrimm and Reggie Bannister from the previous two films, but also has some other familiar faces we haven't seen in a couple weeks. Part 3 marks the return of A. Michael Baldwin, who played Mike in the original, as well as Bill Thornbury as Jody from the original. In Part 2, Mike was recast by James LaGrosse, but Pearson will continue to play him for the rest of the franchise. And Jody was pretty much confirmed dead in the previous film, but looks like that may not be the case exactly. The film also stars Kevin Connors from Pleasantville as Tim, Gloria Lynn Henry from The Devil's Advocate as Rocky, and Cindy Ambule from Jag as Edna. Fred Miro and Chris Stone returned to work on the film's score, and this time around the cinematography was done by Chris Choman of Phantasm 4 and The Three Body Problem. Special effects were headed by Kevin McCarthy of Return of the Living Dead, and the visual effects were headed by D. Carey Pryor of The Lost Boys. Unfortunately, due to some vague conflicts between Universal and Coscarelli, Phantasm 3 only hit a couple of theaters theatrically before being sent straight to video. In the at-home market, it was in the top 100 selling films of the year though. It currently has a 44 and 43% on Rotten Tomatoes, as well as a 3 on Letterboxd. This puts it below the previous films, but honestly not by too much. We've now reached the point in the franchise where the next 3 films are going to be first-time watches for me. I do know Part 3 has a reputation for being a bit more silly and bringing more comedy into the mix, so I'm curious to see how I enjoy that compared to the more surreal and cerebral moments that I really enjoyed in the original. But with all that said, it's probably time we get started. You guys ever consider trying vanilla? Because we're watching Phantasm 3. The movie opens with Mike recapping his relationship with the tall man, saying the entity has been after him since he was a boy. We go back to the ending of the original, where we learned his brother Jody had actually died in a car accident. The tall man was just a figment of his imagination, or so they thought. We also recap the tall man's ooey gooey death from the previous film, where you'll notice there are no shots of Mike. But while the boys were being attacked by alchemy, little did they know that a brand new tall man emerged from the tuning forks to replace the one they killed. We get a slightly different version of the last film's ending, where an injured Reggie watches as the hearse containing Mike and Liz crashes into a fiery blaze. Wow, Liz is fucking dead as a doornail. Well, at least Mike is alive. And Reggie's got a shotgun. You win some, you lose some. He tries to wake the unconscious Mike, but finds that they are surrounded by lurkers, and he collapses from exhaustion as the tall man arrives. Reggie whips out a grenade and threatens to blow them all up, but the tall man doesn't want Mike in pieces. He tells Reggie to take good care of him while he waits. Turns out Mike fell into a coma, and back at his lair, the tall man shows off the tiny brain that lives within the Sentinel orbs. 2 years pass, at which point it seems that Mike is actually dying and heading to the light at the end of the tunnel. His journey is interrupted by Jody though, who tells him it isn't his time and to stay away from the light. The tall man emerges from the light, which manages to jolt Mike awake. Damn, not even awake for 5 seconds and he has to fight off a deranged nurse trying to kill him. Reggie arrives just in time to get some mustard sprayed on him, and the nurse's head opens up to reveal an orb inside. It takes a good look at Mike before flying away. The boys get out of Dodge, but Mike has another vision of Jody as they're leaving. The power goes out as they're loading up the Cuda with weapons, and they do in fact find Jody in Reggie's living room. He does confirm that he is dead, and he doesn't have enough juice to stay in this world long. But then Jody transforms into an orb, but it continues to speak to Mike in Jody's voice. Reggie can't hear the voice and wants to blow it to smithereens, but before he can, the tall man arrives and telekinetically yeets him into a wall. The Jody ball tries to stab him, but the tall man scorches him and tosses him aside as well. He floats Mike into the gate and the two disappear as Reggie passes out. He wakes the next morning and examines the property damage, and Jody manages to choke out the word Holtzville. There is a town in Idaho by that name, so Reggie hits the road in the hopes of saving Mike. On his way, he learns that Holtzville suffered from a toxic spill a few years ago, and it's clear that it's now a ghost town. He comes across a pretty lady helping herself to the abandoned goods in the town, and she has a little too much fun shooting that gun. She's also got a pair of buddies who knock Reggie out and rob him. They plan to take him outside of town and gut him for some reason, and they load him into the trunk of the Cuda. They stop by a big ol' house they intend to loot, but they don't heed the recent looking graveyard out front. They find a couple of decoy old folks in the living room, and the front door slams shut to trap them inside. A voice tells them they're in trouble, and a knife-covered clown mannequin swings down and nearly impales the big looter. A little masked fella crawls around inside the home's secret tunnels, and when the used car salesman-looking looter grabs him, the boy whips out a hatchet and takes out his kneecap. Then he yeets it straight into the lady looter's dome, killing her instantly. The boys follow him outside, and when they don't stop, he launches his razor blade frisbee right into the big guy's throat. Steve Buscemi falls into a pit and gets unceremoniously murked, and the little killing machine cautiously lets Reggie out of the trunk. The boy, whose name is Tim, shares that his family was taken by the tall man, and he's been surviving here on his own ever since. He also shares that the tall man left some lurkers in Holtzville to keep watch over the town, so they head inside before it gets dark. That night, he tells Reggie how his sheriff father was the first one killed, and he and his mom witnessed the tall man exhuming his corpse. He used her own husband to kill her, and Tim watched as the town was picked off until nobody was left. The eyeball watches them, and the next day they find the looters and their pink hearse have vanished. Reggie decides it's time he keeps moving, and he reluctantly allows the violent little orphan to join him. We get a reminder that Reggie's wife and daughter were murdered in the last movie, but don't let that bring the mood down. They come across a home in the neighboring town that is harboring more of the Holtzville orphans, and Reggie tries to leave Tim with this undoubtedly better role model and safer home. You gotta be quicker than that though, Reggie. He rolls up to the Holtzville cemetery and enters a mortuary where he's attacked by an orb. He manages to slam it with a door and possibly injure it, but he's suddenly attacked and bound by two black women. This is Rocky and Tanisha, and I have no idea what the fuck they're doing here. They definitely don't know either, as they have no idea they're in danger, as Tanisha just stands there and takes a ball to the face. She gets brain drained, and Reggie manages to snag the keys to the handcuffs. Rocky poorly attempts to fight the orb with some fucking nunchucks that we're gonna see a ton of in this movie, but thankfully sharpshooter Tim arrives to snipe the ball out of the air. Ignoring the fact this woman was maybe about to kill him, he briefly fills in Rocky before he and Tim keep it moving. He even lets the little dude drive! Very irresponsible but very sweet. That night, the crispy ball gives the boys a hint about which direction they should go, and the next day they run into Rocky. We really had to pad a few minutes in there before she could just join the boys, huh? Rocky says she's been to 4 neighboring towns that have been wiped out, and Reggie has noticed that the tall man is headed east. Their next stop is a town named Bolton, which has the largest Gothic mausoleum in the western United States. They stop at a motel for the evening, where Reggie learns that Bolton was seemingly wiped out by a plague as well. Reggie's creepy ass only pays for a room with a single queen bed, and peer pressures poor Tim to sleep in the car. Fortunately, we don't have to watch him try to coerce this woman for too long, as Rocky cleverly handcuffs him to the headboard. The next day, they come across a group of gravers driving hearses, which they follow into Bolton. They're ambushed by the gravers, but manage to give them the slip. Reggie's very gratuitous wet dream about Rocky is interrupted by Jody, who transports him to a dry lake bed he visited as a child. Jody turns back into a ball and opens up a portal to the tall man's lair with the hopes that they can sneak in and save Mike. They watch as the tall man visits Mike, telling him his brain is the only way out of this cage. Good thing the Jody ball has lasers! But too bad the lasers are noisy. The tall man reverts Jody back to a ball and chases the boys, and as Reggie awakens, Jody helps Mike rejoin them via portal. Jody is unable to stop the connection as the tall man begins to follow, but Reggie once again uses himself as a conduit to close the portal. This slices off the tall man's hands, which turn into a pair of thing-like monstrosities. This provides a couple of fun gags, but the team manages to overpower the creatures. Mike believes it's only a matter of time before the tall man gets him and advises Reg to leave him behind. Speaking of, the dead looters are back and ready to rumble. Lady Looter jumps aboard and bitch slaps Tim, but Mike blows her away with the 4-barrel shotgun. Then the pink hearse hits a rock and crashes, I guess. This damn franchise and its explosive car stunts. The Cuda's tires were blown in the firefight though, so the gang has to hoof it into Bolton. They opt to hole up in the big-ass mausoleum, and the group comes across a cryogenic facility which is being used to preserve some brains. Mike remembers that the tall man hates ice cream, and they hope they can use the cold against him. Mike and the Jody orb make a psychic connection, with the latter showing him a bit about the tall man's master plan. He is amassing an army to conquer various dimensions and worlds, with the dwarves being more of a useful byproduct than the actual goal. They do work as mindless soldiers, but the real prize is their brains once they've been shrunk down. Turns out every Sentinel orb has a shrunken brain inside of it, forcing their minds to act as killing machines. Meanwhile, Reggie's fantasies are once again thwarted when it's revealed that it's actually the looter lady giving him head. Rocky and Tim run into the big looter, and not even headshots are able to put him down. The two fight back but are captured, and the tall man senses Mike's presence and pushes him to the floor. He unveils his army of orbs before switching over to their dimension, and he tells Mike that his journey is finally complete. For some reason, the big looter leaves Rocky hanging and joins his buddy in delivering Tim. Mike tries to warn him about the army of balls, but the tall man shuts that shit down. Rocky and Splitface get into a catfight over Reggie, with our queen ultimately kicking her down a couple stories. Jody helps Tim get free of his restraints, but he's immediately found by the cronies. Fortunately, Jody stabs the big guy and twists his head right off, and Reg blows Buscemi's head off as well. The tall man tells Mike he is going to free him of his flesh prison and make all in the universe known to him. They rush to the embalming room as the tall man operates on Mike's head. Rocky yeets a nitrogen-dipped spear into him, and they use it to push the tall man into the freezer. The big guy seems to go into a dormant state, and Mike sees that he's actually bleeding embalming fluid. The tall man's face cracks open and releases a big golden orb, which bursts out of the freezer and chases Tim. Rocky steps in to defend him, but of course a crony has to get in the way so we can see what the ball is capable of. This one just flies straight through your fucking dome, I guess. Mike peels up his flesh to see another big gold ball hiding underneath, and the tall ball sets its sights on Reggie. He manages to catch it with a plunger, but it releases more blades to overpower him. Rocky and Tim join in to help, and together they manage to submerge the ball in liquid nitrogen. Mike emerges looking not so hot and flees as Reggie follows him. Mike tells him to stay away, but Jody emerges and tells Reg not to believe everything he sees. He's basically telling us to wait for the sequel before flying off into the night. Rocky's gotten wind of what happens to new final girls in this franchise and decides it's time to go on her own path. Good for you, girl. The boys head back inside to search for clues of what happened to Mike, unknowingly walking right into the tall man's army. Tim finds that the tall ball has escaped, and when he comes back he finds Reggie pinned to the wall by a bunch of orbs. He grabs his gun as Reggie tells him to run, admitting things are finally over.
It's never over.
And that's Phantasm 3. This one was a lot of fun, but to be completely honest, I have a lot of mixed feelings on it as well. Starting off with some positives, I think Angus Scrimm has been getting better in every single film so far. Coscarelli never jumps the gun and gives way too much or explains way too much about his goals, but his screen time is slowly increasing with each film. Obviously, we're getting a lot of boys, but there's also a lot more dialogue and he's beginning to build more of a personality beyond the one-liners. I also think the idea of bringing Jody back is really interesting, and it also makes all of the discussion about multiple dimensions and dreamscapes more tangible. It also leans more into the question of when and how he died in the first place, continuing the idea that we can't really trust what we're seeing or being told. Anything at any time can be a dream, a fantasy, or a lie that we want to believe. But while I do like the idea of Jody's return, and I can always respect an actor coming back to reprise a role, I don't really think A. Michael Baldwin and Bill Thornbury brought the same kind of magic that they brought to the first film. They just feel pretty wooden and stiff most of the time, like they're saying really important lines and they just feel underwhelming coming out of them. I also don't get why Mike needed to be captured for half of this movie. We could have used that time to build more character development, build more emotional attachment, or just watch him bond with Reggie, but instead it's just Reggie isolated from him going on a slow-ass road movie with Rocky and Tim. I do think those two add some campy fun into the mix, but there is a solid 45 minutes or so where very little aside from comic relief and things we've seen in the past two films are just being redone or rehashed. It's Reggie and friends on the road hunting the tall man. We visit some ghost towns, we fight some creatures, we head to a mortuary, we fight the tall man wins. There's obviously more nuance to the two films and their differences than that, but you get my idea. Some reviews I've seen also say that this film goes back to the original's more surreal and atmospheric tone, which I really don't see at all here. This was playing like a campy comedic B-movie for me through and through. It's more Evil Dead 2 and The People Under the Stairs this time around, adding in way more jokes, slapstick, puns, and other humor. I don't necessarily mean that as a bad thing, but I just wanted to point out that I don't think of this as some kind of return to form. I think another one of the film's detractors is just its budget, as it's clearly way smaller than what Universal gave to it in Part 2. There were some nice effects here and there, but the zombie looters felt cheap looking, and the finale just didn't feel like a finale to me. Everything just felt quaint and subdued compared to Part 2, but not in a subtle, intriguing, ambiguous way like it did in Part 1. Although I do like that the Sentinel orbs are becoming more integral to the plot, as opposed to just being these weird, really specific weapons that don't really get talked about. The idea that the dwarf brains are housed inside them is super strange, and it's that kind of invention that I otherwise miss in this entry. I rarely found myself being surprised by this film, as opposed to parts 1 and 2, which were always surprising, which is especially strange given that those are the ones I've seen before. That being said, I was never outright bored or not having a good time watching part 3, as there is enough humor and action going on to keep things light and fun. And some stiff acting aside, this movie does create a more concrete idea of the tall man's goals and how Mike fits into his plans. The gold orb still has a lot of mystery and intrigue surrounding it, but now we understand that there's something special about Mike that's more than just the tall man taking an interest in him. And while I don't like cliffhanger endings for films, seeing Mike in this slightly transformed state does have me excited to see what happens in part 4. And Reggie really has taken on the mantle of protagonist in this franchise, and aside from a few kinda creepy moments, I think he's doing a great job at it. I think his pairing with Tim is especially nice, as he becomes a sort of father figure to him. Pretty sure Tim is dead, so that sucks, but it was nice to see that he can offer the same kind of friendship he has for Mike to others. All in all though, I can safely say that part 3 has been my least favorite of the franchise so far. It's actually been a pretty comparable experience to the first 3 Hellraisers for me. The first is a gritty, cerebral, uncomfortable film that I really love. The second is more big and bombastic, more action-packed, but still does a good job at it, whereas 3 goes a more campy tone and gets a lot sillier, as well as having a way lower budget. There are parts of the film I really enjoyed, and it does provide killer balls, explosions, weird little monsters, 4-barrel shotguns, and Angus Scrim camping it up. So while being tonally different, it's definitely still a Phantasm film at heart. If you haven't seen it before, I'd say give it a shot. Just go in with slightly tempered expectations and be ready to have some fun. Well, I think that's about it. What do y'all think of Phantasm 3? How do you feel about the extra dose of comedy in this one? Be sure to let me know down in the comments. Soon we'll be checking out Phantasm 4, but first we've got to check out a patron request. Be sure to join me in 2 weeks as we check out Under the Skin. Well, that's about it. Thank you all so much for joining me, and an extra thank you to my patrons. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and thanks for watching Hamburgers and Horror. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching my review of Phantasm 3. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all my horror reviews, and if you want to help support the channel further, you should check out my Patreon account. You'll be able to vote for future movies and franchises I cover on the channel. Thanks y'all.